All right, Shalom Aleichem, Bruchim Habeim, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this fourth session of Sweeter Than Honey, Talk Midvash, mystical insights into the Pesach Seder. Yesterday, we talked a lot about the Simanim, the different parts of the Seder, the orders of the Seder. And today, we are moving onward, and we're going to talk about the Seder plate. What is the Seder plate in terms of what are the deeper meaning? You know, it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to have a plate with different symbols that represent parts of Yetziat Mitzrayim, different parts of the story, and so we're going to have that. But we have many holidays with lots of symbols. We don't have a Hanukkah plate. We don't have a Sukkot plate. We don't have a Rosh Hashanah plate. Yom Kippur, we're not eating much, but there's no Yom Kippur plate. Right? We have many Chagim. None of them have a plate, a special plate on the table. What's the essence of Pesach that we give it this special Seder plate? And why is the Seder plate structured as it is? Now, it's important to note that for the most part, we have our plate and we have our three matzot on the table, the three matzos, and they're often kept separate. However, there are Seder plates, you can see them, you can find them online or buy them at Judaica stores that are quite large, and they actually have slots underneath the plate for each one of the matzot. And ultimately, according to Jewish mysticism and the Zohar, those three matzot are actually part of the entire Seder plate, that they represent something else that is important for what we are achieving and receiving on Pesach. Now, within Jewish mysticism, within Kabbalah, there's something called the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. I'm going to screen share it and just try to take us through it very briefly. You maybe have seen this image before. This is called the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, and it has each one of these circles or spheres, and in Hebrew called sphirot, right? And the idea is these are different ways through which godliness manifests in our lives and that we can experience godliness. Now, the idea of the keter, the crown, just as a crown is above the head and it is not part of the head, so the keter is said to represent the essence of the divine will on the level that we can't engage with it personally in our own lives. It is above us. Now, that's an important point to note because of the one below it here, dat. Dat means knowledge. Now, if you'll notice, dat in this particular diagram is white as opposed to the rest of them are blue, because dat itself is not considered a sphera. It is a hovering point at the intersection of this line here and this line and this line, from the line that goes from Keter to Tiferet, the line that goes from Chochmah to Gvura, the line that goes from Bina to Chesed. There's an intersectional point here, and that is called the point of Da'at, of knowledge, but it isn't actually a sphera in and of itself. There are 10 Sefirot, according to the Sefer Yetzirah, it is Eser Sefirot, and it says Eser velo Achadasar, Eser velo Tesha, right? There are 10, not 9, 10, not 11. And so if you include Da'at, we'll see 5 plus 3 plus 3 is 11. Da'at doesn't actually exist. Now, we've all heard, likely, of the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic movement. Chabad is an acronym for Chochmah, Bina, and Da'at. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Now, the idea of Da'at is that as the Keter follows through certain channels and manifests in Chochmah, in that psychic, intuitive, imaginative wisdom, as well as in Bina, the academic, intellectual pursuits of understanding. So when we bring both of those ideas together, understand there are certain things that we know intuitively, and at the same time, to recognize that even with that intuitive knowledge, we need to make sure that everything is properly grounded in Torah knowledge and literature, and the exploration of the engagement of the two, that is how we attain dat. And what dat will ultimately be, this knowledge will be a lower manifestation of the keter. So the divine will is in the keter, and we experience it as we come to know about God in our lives. Now, this is very important because these different sfirot, the Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, right, the Chabad, are going to be represented by certain symbols on the Seder plate. And Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferet, which is loving kindness, right, extreme kindness and giving. Gvura is more restriction and boundary, right? This is expansive, this is restrictive. And Tiferet means beauty, but it ultimately means a point of balance. The Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferet are going to be represented. And we have Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. Netzach is endurance. Hod is graciousness or thanksgiving, right? Hoda'ah is to be thankful. And Yesod is called the foundational principle. It has to do with our libido, our energy, the things that get us excited. And Malchut is said to be the place in which we actually exist. It is the lowest point, and it is the vessel that receives from the above into this lower place. And so we are living in a place of Malchut, and by place I don't mean that this particular earth or the universe that we exist in is Malchut, and if we get to the edge of the universe then maybe we'll reach a world of Yesod. That's not it. Our experience is known as Malchut, as divine presence of kingship of the Shekhinah. Remember the divine presence that we talked about previously. And these other layers are deeper layers within ourselves, right? And the Chesed through Yesod are known as the emotional attributes. There's 6 of them: Chesed, Gvur, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, right? And the Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat, as it's manifested as tied together by the Keter, as manifested by the Keter, are known as the intellectual attributes, right? And I can also talk about it as this is the Keter is the unconscious mind, those things we can never attain into true consciousness. Chokhmah is, let's say, the subconscious, things that, again, are under the surface of what we know, but we can't actually, it's not something that we know intellectually, it's just something that we sense, we recognize. Subconsciously, we know the truth. Bina would be our conscious experience, the way we are able to manifest and understand those subconscious experiences. And then once we know those things in our heads, the idea is we have to now bring them into fruition in the world. And we do that through understanding them in our emotional contexts and ultimately to be able to act on them in Malchut. These are also sometimes known as 4 worlds. That Chokhmah is known as the world of Atzilut. It's the closest you can get to be Eitzel, to be close to Hashem. Bina is often known as the world of Beriah, of creation, something from nothing. Then these are known as the world of Yitzirah, the world of formation, which is something from something, right? In Bina, we didn't really have anything. Chokhmah, again, is subconscious. We create from these untethered ideas something more tethered, and then through that we're able to use these, interact with them on an emotional level, know how the things that we intellectually know affect us in our inner lives, ultimately so that we can manifest them in the world we live in. That is a very fast primer into that Eitz Chaim, into that tree of life. We could probably spend many, many, many weeks studying just that, and so many of the symbols that go into it, if not much longer than that. There are certainly people that spend many years studying the Eitz Chaim and the different levels of manifestation. Now, all that being said, why is that relevant? According to the mystical insights, when it comes to the matzot on the Seder table, we have 3 matzot, and the 3 matzahs on the Seder table represent or are represented by the Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat. those matzot have to do with our inner mind. We're going to talk more about those individually in a moment, but I want to go through the rest of the Seder plate. And then we get to the actual Seder plate, right, where we have, according to different traditions, 5 or 6 symbols that rest on the Seder plate. There's the zroa, the shank bone, the beitza, an egg, maror, the bitter herb, charoset, which is the bricks and mortar, sweet dates and wine and apples and nuts concoction that we make to represent the mortar, the karpas, the green vegetable, not necessarily the vegetable, right? Often green to represent the springtime in which Pesach must fall, but also it could just be any vegetable, and that is there. And then there's also, according to some traditions, chazeret. Chazeret being another kind of bitter substance. Often we use horseradish for that, the chrein that we put on our gefilte fish. Okay, so, and then there's the Seder plate itself, obviously. The way that the Zohar and our sages have ascribed these in a mystical way is that the matzot represent the Chabad, the intellectual faculties. That when we look at the matzah, they're supposed to cause us to think something. And what are they causing us to think? Well, why do we eat matzot? There's 2 reasons. One, Hashem told us to. I think we talked about that in our first session, that ultimately the first time we are given the mitzvah of matzah is before we've ever left Egypt, before there has been even the plague of the firstborn. When Hashem gives us that first commandment of establishing a new moon and the commandment of the Korban Pesach, that we should bring this special offering in advance of leaving Mitzrayim, it's at that same time that we are told, eat matzah. Eat it on matzah, eat it on this unleavened bread. Remember, again, we talked about the fact that yeast is the inflation of the ego, and that the deflated matzah is a nullification of our ego. So the first thing is we have to make sure that our thoughts, when we see those matzot on the table, we have to make sure that our thoughts are thin like the matzot, that we are not trying to ascribe anything, our own desires into this Pesach Seder, but we are recognizing that Hashem is the one who takes us out of Mitzrayim. That, we have to recognize, as we said yesterday, that there's a process in all of this, and we have to just recognize that Hashem is the driver of that process, and that is something that we have to go through. We have to know it deeply on the level of Chokhmah, which is represented by the first matzah, but we have to understand it. We have to think about that. What does that really mean? That to understand Hashem, I need to lose my ego, right? There's a certain level of when we try to be in control. So we're trying to say the world should be the way I think it should be, as opposed to recognizing the world is the way it should be, because this is the way Hashem wants it to be, right? Which is a much higher level. But it takes a lot of humility to recognize that we are not in control, right? The whole concept of let go and let God, right? That's the idea of Bina, that we have to get to a place where we fully understand that. And Dat, represented by the third matzah, has to do with, again, knowing these things deeply. Now that we've thought about it, now that we've integrated it and really been able to connect it to different components of freedom. So that idea is that now we will know it, and that is the bottom of matzah. Now, if we'll remember, I'm going to bring the picture up again, right? So that is these 3. Now, if you'll notice, there are 3 triangles. There's this triangle here. Those are our 3 matzot. Matzah 1, 2, and 3. We also traditionally ascribe those 3 matzot to be the Kohen, Levi, Israel. Sometimes also they're said to be the 3 parts of the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, right? The written Torah, the stories of the prophets, of the biblical prophets, and then the Ketuvim would be the writings of later, not writings, things that were essentially given in Ruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration, but not quite on the level of prophecy. Now, when we get to the Seder plate, remember, there are traditionally 5 or 6 different parts of it. And according to Kabbalah, according to Jewish mystical thinking, there should be all 6 symbols on the Seder plate, corresponding to chesed. Kindness is the zroa, right? The zroa is the shank bone. It is part of the, we often use some people use a chicken neck. Some people will actually use a lamb bone or another piece of meat, representing the Korban Pesach, representing the Pesach offering. But we also, it's called the Zroah. We know that when Hashem took us out, first off, that was Hashem's kindness, his chesed, to take us out. It's not because we were deserving of Exodus. It was because Hashem decreed we would be freed from slavery. First that we would be enslaved, and then he would take us out of slavery. And we say, it comes up in the Haggadah, that he took us out with a yad chazaka, a strong arm, and a zeroa nituya, and an strong hand, and an outstretched arm. And this idea that chesed is the zroa, is to represent God's kindness. Then we get to gvura, and gvura is the egg, the beitzah. And again, one of the reasons for beitzah is it represents the life cycle and cycles of time, right? And as we know with life, part of life is that our time on this earth is limited, right? That we have limitations in our lives. And that's actually a really important part of life. If life was unlimited, there would be no real urgency about doing anything. The reason we sense urgency, the reason we need and desire freedom in our lives is because life is limited. And at the same time, we need to make sure that within our lives, we are focused and channeling ourselves on what will birth new things and better things and greater things. And so that is the gvura, right? As represented by the beitzah, the egg also being, when we think procreatively, right? What does the egg do? Especially within human procreation, there are millions and millions of potentials given off by the male in the relationship, and the female and the egg are able to channel one. There is chesed, there is abundant giving, and then there is gvura, there is taking of that abundant giving, finding one, and then that egg will then hopefully birth the tiferet. Tiferet here, though, is represented by maror, the bitter herb. Now, tiferet is often said to be the sphera of the heart. And the idea of tiferet as a heart is we try to live in a place of balance, right? If we're all chesed all the time, just giving, we would have nothing left for ourselves. If we were all gvura all the time, taking, well, you can't live that way, right? It's not the way for a person to be in the world, right? We're trying to establish tiferet, that balance between our giving and our taking, and establishing that balance is something that we do and we can sense and feel in our heart, and that's tiferet. Maror, we eat maror on Pesach because it represents the feeling of bitterness, that our hearts were embittered, that we had too much pain from the galut and from the slavery in Egypt, that we had fallen to the 49th level of impurity, and we were completely disconnected from our own hearts and our own souls. And so therefore we need to make sure that we bring that bitterness on our hearts in order to know that we will work through it and that we can come out of that bitterness, right? But we need to also recognize that sometimes it's only by internalizing the bitter things in our lives that we're able to then move through and integrate them into ourselves so that we can move beyond them. So sometimes people fight against bitterness. They don't want to experience any maror in their hearts, and so they will run away from it and they will push it away and they'll block it out. But what that prevents them from doing is really experiencing the maror, and then it also prevents really experiencing the freedom from that. We get to charoset. Charoset is netzach. Charoset is this endurance or this victory. And you notice that's on the right side together with chesed. right? Again, charoset is the bricks that we had to do. So chesed was Hashem taking us out, and netzach is like the maror. We've integrated that bitterness, and so now we can come down and we can find the sweetness within the bricks and mortar, the wine and the dates and the apples, together with the nuts. All of that is very, very sweet and delicious, but we can only truly appreciate that once we've appreciated the tiferet. Hod represents the karpas. Karpas is Hod is Thanksgiving, and karpas is a vegetable, right? It is something that represents new birth, right? Springtime, new birth, new blossoming. And those are the things that we are the most grateful for when we see new things coming into the world. That comes down to Yesod, which is the chazeret. Chazeret, again, a bitter substance, all right? But the chazeret is that which makes us truly feel all of these things. The idea is that the chazeret integrates it all, right? Like I said, we put it on our gefilte fish. It's that ability to truly balance the sweetness of the gefilte fish with the bitterness of Mitzrayim, and we put them together. And by integrating it all together in the Yesod, that's when we can truly integrate that experience. And then the ka'ara, the Seder plate itself that holds all of these things, the vessel that is able to contain all of these things together, is represented here in the Malchut, in this lower level. Now, we're pretty much out of time, but I want to quickly go through the three matzot again. Remember that they're Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat. That the first matzah, the Chokhmah, is the idea of hamotzi lechem min haaretz. That is the one upon which we are going to make matzah, the blessing of hamotzi, right? That blessing of hamotzi. Recognize that our sustenance comes from those higher levels, right? And our sustenance, even if we're not aware of it, comes from those higher levels. And so we try to make that connection. Now, we also know that when we make hamotzi, we need two matzot, right? We need two things. But the lechem mishneh, representing the manna that brought us through in the desert. And so the bina, again, it's the academic integration of chokhmah. So Hashem gives us our sustenance. The bina is acknowledging that by putting the two matzot together. This is also the matzah that is broken in half, ultimately with one half going to the afikoman. The afikoman represented further down here. And then finally, the third matzah is the da'at one. And that is called the matzah of lechem oni, right? The poor man's bread. We think about this all the time, that matzah can be two things. Matzah is either the bread of our affliction, lechem oni, or it could also be the bread of our geula, the bread of our redemption, right? And why is the da'at lechem oni? Because remember, da'at doesn't actually exist in and of itself. Da'at is just the integration of chokhmah and bina, the way we experience it in our day-to-day lives. Now, also, when we make hamotzi, we add salt. We pour salt on the bread. It sweetens it a little bit, brings out the flavor. The da'at, the third matzah, which is used for the korech, for the sandwich, where it's matzah and maror, ultimately, essentially, it should also have the korban Pesach, but nowadays it doesn't. It's a bitter matzah. It's one that doesn't have any sweetness to it. And it's one that represents for us the idea that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is in galut, that Shekhinah is in exile. And one of the ways we can think about it is it's called lechem oni. Lechem means the bread of our affliction. Lechem is the letters in Hebrew, lamed, chet, mem. And if we change the order of those, we get to melach, which means salt, mem, lamed, chet. Salt being the idea of sweetening things, the idea of bringing out the better flavors. But if we change the order again, we get chet, lamed, mem, which is the word cholem, to dream. And what are we dreaming of over Pesach? We're dreaming of geula, of redemption. So especially as we are eating our lechem oni, the poor bread and the bitter bread that does not have any melech of sweetness, that is eaten together with the maror, remember in Tiferet, that ultimately we are hoping that by integrating both of those things, we will start to dream about geula and the ultimate redemption as it comes through. Those dreams will come through in Yesod, and hopefully we will get to live it then in Malchut. that's it for now. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you once again for joining me for today's mystical insights into the Pesach Seder. That was a lot. If you can watch this again, it will be on Facebook. It will be on YouTube. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Almost Pesach Sameach. We'll be back, Be'ezrat Hashem, on Monday. Have a wonderful day. Shalom.